Hey everyone, Pastor George here. I'm excited to be here for a new thing this morning, and I'm this is a good day for me because I get to talk about one of my favorite people and about something I think that I've heard a lot of kind of under the surface tension or worry among people I've talked to, not only in our congregation but in other places too. And so I wanted to talk about that, but first I want to look at a famous sermon of Paul's from the book of Acts. So let's look at the book of Acts here. This is from Acts 17, verses 16 through 34. And this is when Paul is traveling around Greece and he goes to Athens. Great city. I lived there for a little while, although it's much different now than it was back then for sure. And there's this famous sermon that Paul gives. And so I wanted to read this whole section and comment on it a little bit, and then move into kind of what I wanted to speak about mostly today. By the way, I didn't have any mailbag questions, so it's going to be a little shorter today, so count your lucky stars for that. All right. Let's go into it. So, in Athens, I'll read it. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, the other Christians, right, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks. God-fearing Greeks would be these people, these Gentiles who would come to worship in the synagogue but would not convert to Judaism, usually because of the circumcision requirement. And so they would worship the God of Israel, but they wouldn't become Jews. As well as in the marketplace, so he's talking with those people, day by day with those who happen to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began debate with him. So Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Now these two schools are usually seen as opposing schools. So he's going into these, what this place would be the Stoa of Athens. And the Stoa of Athens was a kind of area where a bunch of teachers and thinkers would get together to debate each other, and it was near the Agora, which is like the marketplace. And so that's where he's talking, right? In the marketplace with those who happen to be here, and there's the Stoa. And so he's arguing with these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And Paul, from his writings, seems to be someone who had a very good education, and so he's able to talk with these people. Just to explain who these people are, right? Epicureans are usually also called cynics. And that doesn't mean that they're cynical. That kind of is a warped thing of it. But they're very focused on pleasure and hedonistic. Not in the sense of like just getting drunk all the time, because then you wouldn't, you'd be hungover and you wouldn't feel good. But trying to maximize as much pleasure in one's life is kind of the goal of the Epicurean. In a very broad sense. I know that like some philosophy PhD just turned over in their grave or something like that. But broad sense, that's what it is. Stoics, on the other hand, you can tell by their names kind of how our words that we get from these schools kind of show the broad strokes views, right? When you think of someone who's stoic, you think of someone who doesn't react to things, middle of the way type of person. That's exactly what they are. It's a very reserved type of philosophy that's much more about not giving in to bodily desires or temptations, but rather mastering yourself and mastering your mind. And so that's the Stoic philosophy. And so they're debating with Paul. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." So they're talking to each other, trying to figure out why he's there. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So it sounds like nonsense to some of them, and others are like, well, this seems to be some weird religion. And these would pass through all the time, just like today, where you kind of get weirdo cults or weirdo religions started all the time. People would be like, oh, this is just like this other thing. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting?" So in Athens, if you go to Athens, or if you see pictures of it, if you Google picture of Athens right now, chances are that you're going to see the Acropolis. And the Acropolis was the main kind of center of Athens. It's where the Parthenon is at, the temple to Athena, which in Paul's day would have still been standing and still looking glorious and still had its statue and stuff like that. And there's other temples there, Temple to Poseidon, temple to Nike, the goddess of victory, stuff like that on the top. Very imposing, beautiful, even like glorious marble. Kind of across the way from that, and what also used to look nice, although now it's just a bunch of jagged rocks, and you're just as liable to break your foot or break your ankle trying to traverse them as you are to be able to like go and see where Paul was there. Is the Areopagus, and it used to be kind of the smoothed over rock face where there would be kind of a place for debating and meeting, and it would be a place where the people of Athens would meet to talk about things. And so they take him to the Areopagus, right, one of the meetings that's happening there, and they have him speak to kind of the assembled people about what he's talking about. And because he speaks eloquently, they think it's like a new teaching or a new philosophy, which in some ways it is, right? And so they say, may we know what this teaching is that you are presenting. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. And so this is Luke, again, who wrote Acts, giving kind of the context for people who maybe aren't as familiar with Athens in the ancient world, or maybe they've only heard of it. But this is kind of getting into the spirit of that place, which Athens has always been seen kind of as the city of knowledge and the city of philosophy in Greece. And so this is what they're doing. It's a big deal to the people who live there, in the way that, you know, maybe Berkeley, California, or Cambridge, Mass is kind of also animated by these people with ideas, right? Because they're surrounded kind of in or Princeton, where they're kind of surrounded by university environments that really prize these things. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and I looked carefully at your objects of worship, and I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." So remember, the Greeks are pagans, and so Paul is walking around their city, and he sees this temple. And this is true. One of the big things about paganism is you wanted to have all your bases protected, right? So you wanted to make sure that every god that's out there was getting the appropriate sacrifices and things like that, because they could bring devastation and ruin upon the city. And so, you know how in Christianity we have the problem of evil? Sometimes it's called the theodicy, where it's like, how could God allow evil things to happen? To the ancient Greeks, they didn't have to, that's not a theological concern for them, because as one of my teachers, my classics teachers in college put it, right? Like, if you did something wrong, right? Like if you went on a road trip or whatever, and you your horse broke its ankle, and whatever happened, right? You wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, why would the gods allow this to happen? You would think that, oh, I might have offered sacrifices to, you know, Zeus, but I forgot to offer a sacrifice to Hermes, and this is Hermes telling me that I should honor him more. And so, like, and that's how the gods act. So there's no surprise that they would do that sort of thing. So it would be very common in a lot of these places just to have temples or inscriptions or little shrines to unknown gods that they would offer stuff to. Be, you know, so we don't know your name, but please don't hurt us. Here you go, right? That type of thing. And so what Paul is saying is here, you know, that unknown God, I'm bringing him to you, right? I'm going to tell you exactly who you're talking about. So he says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him, and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Here's the fun thing. He quotes a Stoic philosopher, Aratus, which is kind of cool, right? It shows that Paul is very learned here. And so he's trying to combine the culture of the Athenians, right, and give them a message to tell them about what Jesus has done. And you'll notice here that what he does is he just tells them the story of creation, basically, right? That, yeah, there's a lot of different, like, he doesn't say that they're worse than Jews or that things like that, right? He's just saying that each of these people have been given their own lands to have, right? But God is going to call all of those people back to him, and that God is not like these pagan gods that you have that can be served or live in temples, right? But he's everywhere. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill, right? Because they build these statues. I talked about the statue of Athena, which had this made of marble, but it was very beautiful. It had gold on it and things like that. If you want to see a recreation, just a recreation of it, they've rebuilt the Parthenon, I think in Nashville or Memphis, Tennessee. Somewhere in Tennessee, they rebuilt the Parthenon. And I think the statue is pretty ugly looking, like the way they've designed Athena. She doesn't look very pleasing, but you can kind of see how tall and huge it would have been back then. And it's in Tennessee. If you're ever there, you can go see it. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And so he then goes on to say, give them kind of the gospel message, right? That people have fallen into idolatry, that they're not worshiping the true God, and God has in the past overlooked that ignorance for a lot of people, but now he's commanding everyone to repent. And so he's going to come back and he's going to judge the world, and the person who's going to do this, you'll notice it's interesting. He never says Jesus, right? What he's doing is he's taking this message and tailoring it for the culture at the time. He's getting all the major points there, but he's not hitting the same things that maybe the Jews in the synagogues would worry about. Rather, he's just building kind of a logical case for the people of Athens to follow. And so he says, repent, and because this person that God raised from the dead is going to come back and judge the world. And this is what happens to that, which is always interesting. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So really, Paul here has some success, but he's largely unsuccessful, and most people kind of make fun of him, right? But there are others who the Holy Spirit touches and they become believers. And so the reason I bring this up is because our topic for today has to do with Christianity in the United States and kind of the future of that because of a new survey. And Paul and the other Christians that we have are living in a world where they are the minority, the vast minority. And I think that with the way that many of us have been raised and the way that history has gone, Christians becoming possibly becoming a minority in some of the countries where we were once the majority is really saddening. Not for bad reasons. It is saddening, but also kind of scary and shocking for a lot of people. And I think it's always important to remember that that's kind of the normal part of the Bible, is that the Christians in the New Testament are always the minority. And so everything that is going on there, right? Most people around them disagree with them. And yet they're still so bold and still so invested in the places that they are, that they go out and they preach the gospel and they still try and convert people, even though most people disagree with them. And so I think it's really important that we remember that. And Paul here gives us a very good example of how to do that, but also that he's in a place that is largely hostile or at least willing to debate and hear his ideas, where they aren't taken for fact, right? He's not in the synagogue where some of these things might just be accepted because Jews and Christians kind of have a starting point together, but rather he's speaking to people who will not accept some of the basic premises, and he has to kind of work there together. And so the reason that got me talking about this was this article from Christianity Today, which I'm not going to read or really talk about a lot just because it sets something else off for me. But the whole article, I'll link it in the description if you want to read it. I think it actually has some problems and some assumptions it makes which aren't really helpful, like all sorts of things. I'm not here to debate about it. You can read it and you can judge for yourself if you care to. But it says Christianity is not necessary for democracy. The basic freedoms and human rights we enjoy as Americans do not require a cultural Christian majority, which I don't necessarily disagree with. there's just some of the other claims that the author makes, Paul D. Miller, that I didn't really find that compelling. But the reason I'm talking about today is because the beginning of this article says, a recent Pew Research report suggested that American Christians could become a minority of the population in less than 50 years. And for some, this has led to a fear that the decline of cultural Christianity in America could spell bad news for the prospects of democracy here. And so I went, wow, I hadn't seen this Pew survey, and you guys know, if you've listened to these before, or my theologues before this, I engage with Pew quite a bit, and so I find their research to be very helpful, not just on religious issues, which they do a lot of, but also political issues too. They seem to be a pretty good barometer for the nation, at least the United States, or even other areas where they do these things. They have some helpful things about what Muslims believe in the Middle East and things like that. But anyway, I wanted to focus on this article from Pew. And this is kind of a breakdown of what they have been, what they discovered. Whoa, that scared me. A book fell down. Man, there must be a ghost in here this morning. Anyway, what they discovered here, and they sum it up in articles, and again, I'll do this, and they give their whole, their report and stuff like that, if you really want to go into it and see if you include it. And so they talk about how Christians could make up, right, if trends continue, Christians could make up less than half the U.S. population in a few decades. And by a few decades, they mean 2070. So if this happens, most of you will be dead. So you might not even live to see this day, because I'll be 77. Oh, angel numbers. Wow, that's a pretty good one. That's good, whatever it is. Good luck or whatever. Good fortune. Anyway, and so this graph right here that you can see, hopefully it kind of comes out well, is you can see that in 1972, Christians made up 90% of the U.S. population. By 2020, we're down to 64. And they give different things here. So they'll say, well, let's assume no one at all in Christianity switches at all. Then it'll be 54%. That's pretty unlikely, right? That people won't kind of move in and out. Steady switching, kind of following the trends, will get us to 46%. Pretty big leaving will get to 39, and if the church completely crumbles, it'll be at 35% of the population. Now, the interesting thing is some people think usually that another religion has to fill the gap, but that's not the case. What's filling the gap is nuns, and that's just people without any religion at all, right? So this is, you see the projected there at 5% in 1972. In 2020, it's about 30%, almost a third of the U.S. population has no religious affiliation. And then by the time of 2070, again, assuming that trends get worse or hold or stay the same, or just nothing happens, they'll make up a third to over half the U.S. population. And you kind of see this happen in Europe. Now, they're very clear in this article, if you read it, that this is just projections into the future, right? This is not gospel. They say, a lot of times in the past, things like this have happened, and some event has come around that's shot people into the churches. This has happened in a few times. This is like you might have heard about things called revivals or awakenings in the United States' history, right? There's two famous ones, although I would say there's three. I would say it was the 1700s one, the 1800s one, and then 1950 actually kind of served as a time of great awakening in the United States, because you had a lot of people rejoin churches, which actually had church attendance had again pretty fallen far in the first half of the 1900s for various reasons. So I think that they're very clear when they show this that this is not, it might not happen, but it could. And so this is important when it comes to thinking about the future of the United States, but also kind of the future of the church and things like that. And again, it's not it's not that one religion is replacing another, although we could kind of argue about that, It's just that one religious attendance in the church or in Christianity is declining pretty rapidly, while people who just aren't associated with any religion is rising pretty steadily. Other religions, as you can see in this graph, right? Like if you were worried or thinking about like Buddhism, for instance, becoming some major cultural force, it won't, right? I mean, they pretty much hold steady. I mean, 6 to 12%. Their other religious identification is going to double in the United States, but that's still pretty low. I'd imagine most of that is coming from Muslims and Hindus, but I wouldn't know. They probably talk about it in here somewhere, but I think that they're not really that concerned. And so what is this? You know, and this is something I've seen because I've heard people like mention this anxiety to me of like, you know, people used to go to church in the United States, used to be so much more religious, and now it's not. And I think that like with everything, as time moves forward, we always lose something, but we always gain something as well. And I'm not going to say in 1970, 1972, it might have been nice that 90% of Americans were affiliated religiously with some body, with some church somewhere. I think that's good, but at the same time, like the church doesn't decline like this for no reason. The stuff was going wrong. The church had messed up here, and we are living in the consequences of it. I'm not saying, you know, the CPC messed up or anyone in particular. I think it was just the cultural assumptions and the weakness of kind of the church leaders in order to see kind of what they had created. And of course, it didn't start in 1972. It was going on before this, right? It's just that there had been a lot of kind of rot that has been in the church of the United States and in the West generally that we are paying the price for now. And I think part of paying that price is a pruning that is happening in the church, where people who see it just as a cultural idea and not something that's really that important in their lives are leaving. They're not hostile to it, but or maybe some of them are, but most people usually aren't pretty hostile to Christianity or to religion. They just kind of like, it's not my thing, peace out, right? And so I think that like there's a pruning going on here where we are saying, and I think that's why you see a big push among a lot of younger pastors and younger church leaders for doctrinal clarity and people really believing in what we're teaching, right? Not we as in like me, George Erlinson or whatever, but rather like what the church is teaching to the world. Like that you have to really believe in this stuff. It's not just like a happy-go-lucky country club, which it really kind of looked like in a lot of churches in the 1900s, right? That's just what it was in a lot of places. It was a kind of like a more religious kind of Rotary Club for a lot of people. So we're down to 64% in 2020. So, you know, I don't know, probably still around that point here. And that's probably going to continue to go down unless, of course, the Holy Spirit works in a big way, which we should pray for and hope for. You never know. I actually think that this is that there's a good chance of this happening because Gen Xers and millennials have kind of hit a wall in terms of being in a world without meaning. And I actually think that if you look at the trends, the least religious generation is Gen X. Millennials are a little bit more so, but I would not be surprised if Zoomers or Gen Z ends up being more religious than millennials, because I think they're kind of looking back and seeing kind of the pitfalls that previous generations have fallen in and are trying to correct for that. So you never know, though. All right, I'm not Nostradamus or whatever. I'm not a prophet, so I can't tell you what it's going to look like. But again, causes a lot of anxiety, as is the case because articles like this one get written. So what I wanted to look at this book by Augustine. It's called The City of God. Tremendous book. I pulled up the opening right here on our screen. And it's related to what Paul was talking about. City of God is written by Augustine in the 400s AD. And Augustine was a bishop of Hippo Regius, which is a city in North Africa. Now it's called Annaba, and it's in Algeria, I think, right next to Tunisia. Anyway, it's called City of God, but actually, what its full name is concerning the city of God against the pagans. And most of this book is considered a really important work of philosophy. Most of this book, though, is actually kind of apologetics, where it's presenting the Christian case to pagans who were living at the time. Because at Augustine's time, right, Christianity was the state religion of the Roman Empire. But if you know anything about the 400s, that's when the Western or Latin-speaking part of the empire falls apart. And Augustine himself, like, in case you remember or you heard these names before, he would die in a siege of his city when the Visigoths, I believe it was the Visigoths, it might have been another Gothic group, one of the barbarian groups that kind of came down and conquered the Roman Empire. One of them sieges the city of Hippo Regius, and he dies there during the siege. And so, like, that's all going on. So the Roman Empire, right, this great symbol of power and of stability for so many people is crumbling. And a lot of people at the time said, you know why it's crumbling? Because we left the gods behind and we became Christian. And that's weakened us, right? And so this whole time, Augustine uses this to kind of argue against that, but also presents a case that Christians, right, do not tie ourselves to kind of institutions, especially secular ones, right? But we instead tie ourselves to the city of God versus the city of man or the city of earth, right? And so that's kind of his big thesis. And I wanted to just read from his introduction. So this is from a website called New Advent. I think it's a Catholic website, but really what it is it's a compendium of like a bunch of ancient church documents and teachings, and it's like all free. Usually that's because they're older translations, but this one isn't too bad. So this is just the introduction, and so I'm going to read this to you, and we're going to again kind of just look at something I think is really important. So this is what Augustine says, and just like any good English teacher would have you say, right, he states what his thesis and argument is going to be in the opening. He says, "The glorious city of God is my theme in this work, which you, my dearest son, Marcellinus, suggested, and which is due to you by my promise. I have undertaken its defense against those who prefer their own gods to the founder of this city, a city surpassingly glorious whether we view it as it still lives by faith in this fleeting course of time, and as sojourns, as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly, or as it shall dwell in the fixed stability of its eternal seat, which it now patiently waits for, expecting until righteousness shall return unto judgment." Psalm 94:15. "And it obtains, by virtue of its excellence, final victory and perfect peace." And you can see from the size of this thing that what he says next is true, right? "This is a great and arduous work, but God is my helper. For I am aware what ability is requisite to persuade the proud, how great is the virtue of humility, which raises us, not by quite a human arrogance, but by a divine grace, above all the earthly dignities that totter on this shifting scene. For the king and founder of this city of which we speak has in Scripture uttered to his people a dictum of the divine law in these words: God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6 and 1 Peter 5:5. But this, which is God's prerogative, the inflated ambition of a proud spirit also affects, and dearly loves that this be numbered among its attributes, to show pity to the humbled soul and crush the sons of pride. Virgil, Aeneid 6 through 854. And therefore, as the plan of this work we have undertaken requires and occasion offers, we must speak also of the earthly city, which, though it be a mistress of the nations, is itself ruled by the lust of its lust of rule. So, a lot of interesting things going on here. What Augustine is saying when he says this is he's saying we live for a heavenly kingdom, right? A heavenly city. We do not work or live for earthly things, right? And in fact, earthly kingdoms are kind of disingenuous, especially because they can end up making idols for themselves. And of course, he's speaking here of like physical idols, the statues and worshiping gods, but also other idols, right? And one of the things, the big thing he contrasts is virtue of humility and the sin of pride, right? He talks about God resists the proud, gives grace to the humble, and that oftentimes we can end up crossing our minds and think that, well, these pride, which is a big deal in the ancient world, right? And being able to say you're better than other people is like why you would want these types of things to continue, why you would prefer the earthly city over the heavenly one. And what he's saying here is, this is all crumbling around us, and these things happen, right? He just says that this happened, fleeting course of time, sojourns as stranger in the midst of the ungodly. And that's what happens, right? These things just happen as time goes on. And I think that the point of this book is to get people to turn away from the idols that they are worshiping and turn towards God and the King and founder of the heavenly city. One of the things, again, that he does very well here, and this is Augustine to a T because he's a Latin speaker, and he writes, obviously read all of this in Latin, and he quotes the Aeneid by the poet Virgil, which was a major poem that was written about the time of Augustus, so, around the time of the birth of Christ, about kind of the founding of Rome. And in it, he quotes this line where it says that a proud spirit also affects and dearly loves, that this be among its attributes, to show pity to the humbled soul and crush the sons of pride. And so he tries to show, even from their own writings, how what they believe, these pagans or things like that, kind of foreshows what God is going to do and what's most important. Although Virgil in the Aeneid might not have agreed with Augustine on this being a great thing, but this is Augustine showing exactly what Paul does here when he quotes the philosopher, right? Is he's relating it to his culture at the time. And so I think that if you want to, I would get a more modern translation. It's a little better. It reads better than what I just wrote. But I can't show you guys this because the print is so small. But if you want to check out The City of God, you should. And I think the important thing, as I close out for today, the important thing to remember with all of this is that time kind of will throw new things at the church, but nothing is new under the sun, and that it's really important for us as Christians to be able to match the time and place that we are living in, to preach to the people who need to hear it, and to remember that, like, even though there might be things that pop up that maybe discourage us about the state of the institutional church or the number of believers or something like that, is that we do not live for now, right? We don't live for the earthly city. We live for the heavenly city. And that we are going to be fine if we are ever a minority. And that's nothing new, right? This is something that's been around. So just wanted to bolster you today and remind you that you are part of an important group. And you are the one who is going to be the Paul to many people, or the Augustine to many people, even if you don't see yourself that way in a culture where there's less of this going on. So thank you guys for listening today. I hope you guys have a good rest of your Thursday, and I will see you on Sunday for worship. Peace out.